السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم ما بعد. And welcome to another video on the Islamic Knowledge YouTube channel. And in today's video, we're looking at this book, The Origins and Evolution of Islamic Law by Wael, Hallaq, printed by Cambridge University Press. Again, this is a fantastic book. There are definitely flaws within it before someone points out that he's a non-Muslim, etc. Yes, 100%. And that's why you don't read these books as though you're reading it with amanna or saddaqna type of mentality, but with the mentality of benefiting but also critiquing. And you shouldn't be reading this, yes, definitely, if you don't have any foundation in the Islamic sciences. But once you do, then it is worth benefiting from what they come up with. And definitely this book was printed in 2005, and therefore at that time, I don't know if he's a Muslim right now, but definitely in 2005, Hallaq was not a Muslim, as it's quite clear from this book, as we'll come to just now. I have got my personal notes on this book, and they are quite legible, so you get to see at least the important and beneficial points at each page number. So you can see here as well, a significant function of the early qadis was storytelling, according to Hallaq on page 40, 43. So on each page, you will notice that the beneficial points are there, and you can find these notes on our Telegram channel. So if you go on to Telegram and type in @IKCourses, go in and you will find the notes are there for you to have a look at, and you can just peruse through them and see, okay, this is a beneficial point, this is an interesting point. And I have put this exclamation mark. Usually this signifies a strange comment or a comment which I can't make sense of. So let's have a look at what this book actually looks like. So if we have a look, he starts right from the start of literally like the history of Islam. So you could say he starts off from discussing the whole idea of the Arabs, even the history of the Arabs. He gets into all of that as well. I'm just trying to find the contents page. I'm sure the contents page is here. The only issue is that sometimes I actually write between the contents page. So here it is: introduction, the pre-Islamic Near East, Muhammad and Quranic law, the emergence of an Islamic legal ethic, the early judges, legal specialists and the search for religious authority, the judiciary coming of age, prophetic authority and the modification of legal reasoning, legal theory expounded, the formation of legal schools, law and politics, caliphs, judges and jurists. Again, very good book, but there are problems here and there with the whole book. But I do think there are some very beneficial points in the book. For example, this part is problematic, right? On page 9, he presents kind of like the Orientalist version of what happened in the Abraha story. I guess for many of them, did the story even happen? That's the problem. So here he says, the latter scheme, however, reportedly fell apart when disease wrought havoc with Abraha's military campaign. Obviously, it can never ever be a miracle. That's not allowed. That's just can't be, because that would defeat the whole kind of edifice of the Orientalist structure, and sent it back to the Yemen in ruins. This setback signaled the end of Abraha's rule, and with it the hegemony of the Abyssinian kingdom over the Yemen. So basically, there were no pelting from the skies, according to Hallaq. It was actually all a disease. In any case, like I said, we don't agree with this, but it's just interesting to see what he is coming up with. Now here, this is a part where I would say definitely Hallaq cannot, I don't know, he can't be a Muslim for saying things like this. Like, he's saying Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam was influenced by Zayd ibn Amr, the father of Sa'id ibn Zayd. And because Zayd ibn Amr was part of the Hanifiyun, he was influenced, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam was influenced by Zayd ibn Amr. This is literally a statement that would make you a kafir if you said it, if you were a Muslim. That's why I'm saying that I don't think he was a Muslim when he wrote this. He says, in Mecca and probably immediately after arrival in Medina, his message was articulated in terms of continuity with Judaism and Christianity. Islam represented little more than a pure form of these two religions. The original faith that in its Judaic and Christian forms had been corrupted by later followers of the two religions. That's fine. Already in Makkah, this is the problem. Already in Makkah, Muhammad conceived of himself as a Hanif, probably under the influence of a certain Zayd ibn Amr. Fundamentally monotheistic, Hanifiyah appears to have been specifically, and he continues, right? So I don't know, I find that comment really problematic. On page 28, he says that when the Arabs took over Iraq and Syria, this is a decent, interesting point. When the Arabs took over Iraq and Syria, they were fully moving to a culture that they recognized. And this is quite important, that he argues that the Arabs were not like, they didn't move like how tribes, how the Mongols used to move. They were basically, they knew how to stay in one place, basically, right? So he argues here, even if we assume that the Peninsular Arabs came to the Fertile Crescent devoid of any high culture, as some modern scholars assert, whatever these new Muslims happened to incorporate into their new empire and legal system was fundamentally Near Eastern and Semitic, however thin or thick were the Byzantine and Roman veneers. But we do not need to go this far. This chapter has shown that these Arabs were demographically, religiously and commercially, and we may add politically and militarily, an integral part of the larger Near East and its culture. They hardly could have found the Fertile Crescent to be as new or different as more recently the French found Algeria or the British India. The Fertile Crescent was no more than a cultural neighbor whose home and conduct many problems they knew and understood. The reason he's mentioning this is that some of the Orientalists like Patricia Crone and others, they do argue this idea that Islamic cultures were borrowed from the Byzantines and the Persians when they conquered the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. They kind of stole their culture as well, kind of adopted a lot of what the Persians and Byzantines were doing. So he's trying to show that, and the argument that Hallaq is making is that Orientalists constantly are trying to make it look like the Muslims are dependent on the West. Even in how they understand Islamic history, it's always that they needed the Byzantines. They were not complete until they took the culture of the Byzantines. So that's an interesting point. On page 56, there is a comparison, you could say, of how Hallaq understands the Sunnah and up against the Ahlul Ra'i issue, compared with, you could say, Shaht. So you could say a comparison of how Hallaq and Shaht see Sunnah versus Ahlul Ra'i. So he says here on page 56, he says, even discretionary opinion was often based on sunan, given expression by the conduct or opinion of Ahlul Ra'i, who, to put it tautologically, at times fashioned the sunan. During the half century following Muhammad's death, prophetic sunnah, based in part of his seerah, was only one of the several types of sunan that constituted an authoritative legal source for qadis, although it certainly gained increasing importance during this period. This is kind of what Shah says, but like I said, in one of his articles, Hallaq is quite adamant to show you that his arguments are a bit different from Shaht. But from a traditional perspective, we would say they're very similar still. Thus, far from possessing the status of the exclusive Sunnaic source of legal behavior that it would later acquire, there is no indication that it was distinguished from the other Sunan during this period, although in stature it may have been more prestigious. The Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ never really stood out from the Sunan of the Caliphs, the Sunan of the Qadis, etc. It was still the Sunan of the companions, the Sunan of the Caliphs as well. It wasn't really anything that stood out until a lot later, and obviously Shaht attributes that to Shafi'i. The beginnings of specialization in what gradually came to be an independent field of knowledge marked the rudimentary beginnings of a fundamental transformation that culminated in prophetic sunnah as the exclusive source of sunan-based law. The key issue, I would say, that differentiates between Hallaq and Shaht is basically Hallaq believes Islamic law itself started around about 124, whereas Hallaq is quite adamant that it did start from the 5th year of Hijrah, although the Islamic law was not just based upon the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, it was based upon other sunnah. Obviously, from a traditional perspective, this is all just ridiculous. We would just say it was always based upon the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Even on page 103, he starts to speak about the sunan of the caliph, sunan of the companions, sunan of the Prophet, and how all of these were valid forms of sunnah until the muhaddithun more or less stipulated that sunnah is only the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is also, again, highly problematic statement for traditionalists. We wouldn't really accept any of this. So they included sunan of the companions and early caliphs that must be seen on their own as representations of Islam's religious experience. That these sunan and interpretations constituted a rudimentary form of Islam made them no less Islamic than other later discourses. And he continues, if one accepts the fact that Abu Bakr and Umar's sunan, to use only two examples, were established by these two men in the spirit of the then understood Quranic and prophetic mission as two leading companions who understood best what the Prophet and Islam meant to achieve, then one cannot argue that these sunan were secular and thus lacking in Islamic religious content. So he does try to kind of balance it out a little bit, but it is still very Orientalist way of speaking. On page 104, this is where we get to see the key disagreement between Hallaq and Shaht, and he indicates towards it, but I don't think he mentions Shaht explicitly on this page, but he does in other places. So I think he references Shaht here, cited in Shaht Origins. And the key disagreement is that when it comes to Islamic law, Shaht links the idea of the rise of ahadith with Islamic law, and Shaht basically feels that ahadith came into existence around 125, and that's when Islamic law came into existence. And Hallaq feels Islamic law existed right from the start. However, ahadith came into existence much later, around 60th year of Hijrah. Again, all of this is problematic from a traditional perspective, which we believe is the correct version. And all of these people obviously have a lot of reading to do, and they will come to the real conclusion, inshallah, either in this world or the hereafter. On page 164, Hallaq actually really interesting. When he starts getting into formation of legal schools, it's a really interesting read, to be honest with you. They look at a lot of what we might call like the sociological structures, and they start studying things which sometimes in the Arabic books it's not fully there, context, etc., which I do like about the English books. They do look at a lot of, you could say, the context of what was going on in the time, the reality on the ground. They look at things like that, and that is where the English books can be of beneficial use. And this is where he critiques Melchett, for example. So Melchett is of the opinion that the formation of the legal schools kind of came behind. He says here the main reason so he critiques Melchett. Melchett is of this idea that it was the student-teacher relationship that basically led to the formation of a proper school. So education and transmission of legal knowledge from teacher to student cannot therefore explain the formation of the madhabs, as one modern scholar has recently contended. That's Hallaq critiquing him. And Hallaq is saying, why does a student become attached to a certain teacher, and why does he want to follow that teacher only? It's authority. So authority construction is what Hallaq refers to as the primary reason as to why madhahib came to become official legal schools of thought around about 325, 350 Hijri. And so the main reason behind this mistaken diagnosis is the definition of the madhab as a personal school, which in our analysis represents merely a middle stage between the formation of the scholarly circles and the final emergence of doctrinal schools. So really intricate discussion, but really interesting. If you've read Melchett's work, then this part really does kind of fit to making a lot of sense. Again, our response to both Melchett and Hallaq would be, okay, even authority construction, what causes that? It has to be tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has to be something Allah has written for this to happen. So I don't know, it's something for us as traditionalists to kind of think about. Here, however, this part on page 163, probably one of the best definitions of a madhab that I can find. Really, really good. The madhab, therefore, was mainly a body of authoritative legal doctrine existing alongside individual jurists who participated in the elaboration of or adhered to that doctrine in accordance with an established methodology attributed exclusively to the eponym, the latter whose knowledge was presumed to have been all-encompassing and to have been utilized by him to confront revelation directly, thus becomes the absolute and independent mujtahid. And all subsequent mujtahids and jurists, however great their contributions, remain attached to their loyalty to the tradition of the madhab that is symbolized by the figure of the founder. So this is the key part. A body of authoritative legal doctrine existing alongside individual jurists who participated in the elaboration of or adhere to that doctrine in accordance with an established methodology attributed exclusively to the eponym. I thought that was a really nice definition of a madhab, and it kind of helps us to understand what's happening. And there are, like I said, a few mistakes here and there as well throughout the book. For example, on page 187, he refers to Ibn Abi Du'ad as Ibn Abi Dawood. Right, so this Ibn Abi Dawood is a totally different person. That's the son of Imam Abu Dawood. So Ibn Abi Dawood, and he says he was responsible for the mihna, and that's really strange because Imam Abu Dawood was probably a young man himself, never mind his son being probably a little child at that point. So it wasn't Ibn Abi Dawood, it was Ibn Abi Du'ad. But that's me being a bit petty. But like I said, in terms of how he speaks about the different empires, their roles as well in the formation of the madhahib, I think it's a really, really good book. Again, you do need to have read a little bit before you read this book, because it is a bit of hard language in certain places. That is how Hallaq writes in general, but you're looking at approximately 200 or so reading, 206 pages of solid reading. I do think it's a good book. I think it's a beneficial, and I have used it in my book, An Introduction to the Hanafi Madhab Volume 1. For example, another really interesting part is one of the pages in the book wherein he explains what led to a hadith becoming the ultimate source. So was it like what led to these Ahlul Ra'i and Ahlul Hadith coming together? So he tries to kind of elaborate upon that as well, on the different usages and the different kind of causations behind that happening. So I think it's a good book. I think you'll enjoy it. Again, you do need to be a little bit well read on some of these topics, and I do hope you access the notes as well. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you join me for the next one. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.